Well, I think what's so interesting about the history of the EU, and it was fascinating how this played no part whatsoever in Britain in the debate during Brexit, or very little part, was the sense to which when the EU was created, it was very deliberately designed to be a mechanism that avoided conflict. There was very quickly a recognition in France and Germany in particular after World War II that competition over their economic resources had led to conflict. And if what you did instead was to take those resources, and particularly this at the time was coal and steel, and created economic cooperation, you immediately removed the engine of war from Europe. And it was very interesting that when the EU was given the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago, it was greeted as almost an issue of hilarity in the UK. A lot of the newspapers, or the headlines were things like, oh, we've run out of people doing good things in the world if it's been given to the EU. I think if you live in Poland or in Central Europe, it was much more obvious why. You hadn't been invaded for 50 or 60 years, which was rather unusual. But I think in the clamour around issues of sovereignty and perceptions of federalisation, I think what has been forgotten is the sense to which actually one of the reasons why we haven't had World War III because of the recent financial crisis, comparing, of course, to what happened in the interwar years and led to World War II, was because we put institutions in place, part of which is the EU, to try and protect ourselves from those very eventualities.
So give us an example. How might, say, the financial crisis of 2008 been handled differently had Europe not been acting as a group?
Yeah, well, when we look at the economic response of the European Union collectively, and and in Britain it was, oh, great, we're not part of that. Isn't it fantastic? We don't have to make commitments that we're obliged in many ways around that. It was seen as a positive. What actually happened was there was a sense of collective economic destiny. What, of course, happened in the late 1920s and early 1930s was when the US economy collapsed, it called in its debts. If that meant the German economy collapsed, well, who cares? We understand profoundly and deeply, and when I say we, I don't just mean political elites who, look up their noses because they're well educated. I think this is understood much, much wider, and I think we don't give enough credit to the sense to which across Europe, particularly in Central Europe and in Western Europe on the continent, this is built into people's lives, the sense that we have to learn those lessons from the past, and petty differences result in slaughter. They don't result in minor tensions.
And the UK almost brushing off Europe or laughing at it in some regards. Was it perhaps quick to understand protectionism? The fact that was it always doomed to fail, that Europe essentially at the end of the day, each country will always protect their homeland first? Yeah,
I think it's so interesting because the very thing that was making people laugh was exactly what had driven the referendum in the first place. There can be no doubts whatsoever that the European Union has issues. It frustrates, it is perceived as an elitist bureaucratic organisation. And I don't think anybody from wherever you are on the political spectrum would disagree that that is an absolutely valid, if not an urgent conversation. What I think has been lost along the way is what it was created for, why it continues to exist, and where there have been successes in that particular regard.
Is this where it all fell apart? That campaign, the Remain campaign in the UK, it wasn't strong enough pro-Europe?
Well, what's interesting is I think it was pro-Europe in the wrong kind of way in many ways. Attempting to defend its political structures wasn't actually a way of best communicating what Europeans have been served by the European Union in its existence. Economics was always a basis for the European Union. I think along the way that has been forgotten. And frankly, European leaders have been incredibly remiss in their failure to communicate that this was always a political union that was designed to create economic, cultural, and to an extent, therefore, political cooperation. What has been lost along the way is a sense that it's about whether our bananas are all at the same angle, and that whether we drink pints or whether we drink half litres. And that's very easy for quite jingoistic parties and movements to take advantage of and to create newspaper headlines.
You've actually said, though, you're worried about the peace and the stability of Britain. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, I wrote a piece just before the referendum in which I was saying to the British voters, and I really try and, my job is not to tell people what to do. I'm trying to add to the analysis. But my point was, forgetting the successes in stability and safety and security, and how they've been not just provided, not accidentally, but as a deliberate purpose of the European Union, is to fail to recognise how much of a glue that has been to keep Europe together. And the minute one separates from it, it is inevitable that we move into a period where if we're not economically cooperating, we by default are economically competing. And as much as the British government seems determined, as does the European Union, to move into an area where we have a sense of a reorganised economic relationship and an economic cooperation, the more the Brexit approach takes hold. And of course, my fear was Brexit is the first domino that hits others. And in many ways, that we can breathe a kind of a European collective sigh of relief that maybe that hasn't happened in Holland and then in France. But all you need is one or two Brexits, and the capacity of the European Union to ever genuinely provide a mechanism for European cooperation again. And once we go back to competing over resources, once we go back to nationalism not being us laughing at the rugby or laughing at the soccer match when we're playing each other, but goes back to the issues that drove competition between empires, that drove our countries not just to compete in a general economic sense, but to galvanise our entire nations in competition and drive quite extreme nationalisms that emerged as a natural consequence of that. We return to those days, and we are in the dark moments that we saw, of course, in previous global conflicts.
Is on the brink of collapse?
I don't think it is necessarily, but I think there is a danger. And when I talk about the geopolitics and try and explain to people the interrelationships, if you think about the migration crisis and the fact that it was driven not by an event in Europe, but it was driven, of course, by geopolitical events taking place in the Middle East. But of course, what that has done in terms of challenging fundamental structures and precepts of the European Union, like free movement. And I and many others I've spoken to, from ex-generals to some of the region's leading economists to senior political figures, there is a exasperation of the lack of a sense that Europe has recognised the urgency of this, that what has happened as a consequence of this geopolitical maelstrom in the Middle East, happening at a time of such political uncertainty in Europe, it required a response. It required a sense that Europe understood that this challenged one of its fundamental beliefs, one of its fundamental institutions, and the sense to which many believe that the European Union has had a kind of a business-as-usual approach.
Sounds like you're very much pro-Europe, pro-unity. We're sitting in Switzerland. What do you make of the fact that Switzerland is an island on its own, not part of the European Union?
Well, I'm kind of pro if we look at that in the sense of if you put together maths, what is it after the equation? I think the European Union has addressed things that led to conflict in the past. How one seeks to be a country that remains in that kind of neutrality framework, I think is absolutely fascinating, because part of what the populism of the current time has demanded in Europe is that people take positions. There is a sense of, do you think the European Union is great and you're committing to it? Are you going to be part of a new politics that is challenging it? That poses very interesting challenges for countries like Switzerland, who have found an interesting balance of not being in it, yet being fundamentally economically and politically associated with it. And of course, a lot of that depends on what develops within the politics of this country.
How effective can a country like Switzerland be on the periphery of, say, Europe, where if economic competition becomes rife once again and we revert back to protectionism, can it really be effective in negotiating those sort of situations? I
think Switzerland's appeal both to itself and outside in the past has been the fact that it has the economic frameworks and capacity to provide that level of stability. I don't think Switzerland is trying nor is attempting to frame itself as one of the most powerful political influences within the European Union. The question is whether it will be asked to demand that it starts taking some of those political stands and those political positions. And that's why I say a lot of what will drive the domestic realities here, and whether they start reflecting some of those more divisive, are you black or are you white, rather than the where are we within the grey politics, which I think has been so effective for so many decades. And of course, some of that has taken place there in terms of issues around migration and Islam and various issues that, of course, have affected Switzerland like they have many other countries.
And it also begs the question, in some situations, some nations not being that willing to talk, how easy is it then to be the peacemaker in between?
Well, the irony is a peacemaker implies that others are in conflict. So there's an interesting dichotomy where actually whether Switzerland comes into its own exactly when Europe needs someone who is not deeply embroiled within these arguments, is not seen as someone who's already got the mud on their hands because they are part of it and actually can step in and provide that. So I think what's fascinating for Switzerland going forward is where does it see itself in a calm Europe, but also what role does it play as an actor who can facilitate changing dynamics when Europe is in crisis. And of course, history poses some really poignant challenges in that regard. If you ask people about Switzerland in World War II, most people are not going to give you a positive response. They are going to give you issues that are seen as highly controversial. Switzerland potentially has an opportunity in a time of division in Europe, exactly because it sits in that one foot in, one foot out dynamic to provide...
Opportunity could it have, Hagai? Because if you look at something like Brexit, it's potentially negative for Switzerland in the sense that some of the rights it's previously enjoyed with Europe could be taken away because Europe needs to set an example to Britain.
Well, what is interesting about that is we are still to see whether that is the case. It certainly seems that what the British are demanding, what the European Union is demanding, it seems as if there is a chasm between those two positions. But I think we've seen enough where the notion that Britain will be punished for the sake of what it will send to every other actor, I'm not sure we're seeing any serious contenders within the formation of the Brexit process who are pushing for that within the European Union. I think there is a recognition that Britain needs to pay a price, but not that it needs to be the sacrificial lamb from which the rest of Europe will feast. And so I think in many ways that should bring solace to Switzerland rather than the opposite.
Before we move away from Brexit, was there a better man, better woman to have navigated out of Europe? Has Theresa May, in your opinion, done a good job so far?
Well, Theresa May went for a very dangerous strategy, which was to go for an election where she herself would have the mandate. Now, the political logic of that, and certainly within the history of British politics, made perfect sense. I'm not inheriting someone else's government, this is my own. But of course, what happened by not only, we normally would use the word win in every single British election. We now have this remarkably unusual reality of 2 elections in a row where that has not been the case, and a coalition or a minority government as we have now has resulted. We have a situation where Theresa May has found herself in a position where she has absolutely no leeway. She can't allow for a grumpy minority in her party to vote and everything gets passed. They have the capacity to end everything. And if you look at, for example, something that in the past would have had no impact on this, we have a referendum in Ireland about abortion. So what? Well, Northern Ireland suddenly says, well, we need to be balanced with that. We suddenly have the party who's keeping Theresa May in government and allowing her bills to be passed, who are deeply opposed to this, saying, well, if you make any attempt to rebalance this abortion dynamic in Northern Ireland, well, your government's in effect going to fall. So suddenly we have very peripheral issues that in the past she may have commented on and could have gone about her business and concentrated on the incredibly difficult job of negotiating Brexit. Suddenly, every single thing that can be dropped on the scale, every speck of dust, potentially makes it wobble and makes it imbalance.
Politics is back and forth. Any chance of a U-turn?
What kind of U-turn? From who? The British
UK
public or from the
back
British?
into Europe.
Well, the one way of doing it, of course, is another referendum. But I've heard a number of British political commentators almost joking about this, but I think they were actually quite accurate, which is that some people in Britain had just had enough of voting. They didn't want another vote. Why am I being given another vote? We're not the kind of democracy which gets asked our opinion every 2 or 3 years. So I think actually anybody seeking to reclaim the British political agenda by having another referendum is likely just to cause a lot of frustration.
Had it been the Swiss people, on the other hand, they're used to voting,
right,
so
well,
it might have worked out.
That's right. Here we have, of course, a country of constant reference and opinion taking, and this is not our reality in the UK. And of course, this is part of what of course we found out in the European Union. Trying to combine democracies sounds like something that makes perfect sense when they are so different with such different values. The more we try and bring them together, the more we start noticing the differences and the areas of conflict, not just the areas of agreement. Well, what's so fascinating is this looks all economic, but it is the geopolitics behind it which is so important, and which is not just happening now, but I think is we're going to see more and more clear as the years develop. We're in a relatively unusual moment where we have gone from a clear superpower contest between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. We then had this moment of one megapower, quite unusual. We haven't seen it for many centuries, where one state dominated. But as the United States is beginning to wane, and it's not weak, but it is certainly weaker, what we are having is the beginnings of these shoves and pushes and nudges that are going to be leading to the superpower contest of the years to come. And while a huge amount of that is likely to be between the United States and China, that of course puts Russia in a very problematic position. The idea that it's going to sit back and say, well, we're no longer a leading power, we're in the kind of A-, B+ category, is hugely problematic to Vladimir Putin, but hugely problematic to the entire Russian strategic establishment. So we have both a China-US dynamic that's developing, plus almost a more defensive response from Vladimir Putin of Russia's position in the world. And this is all while, of course, we've had this remarkable political development in the United States, which was the election of Donald Trump, who is proudly and celebrating to his supporters that he is seeking different politics. He's not going to play by the rules. And if that means launching a trade war with China and even with allies, then so be it.
So whether Donald Trump likes it or not, the world is interconnected, especially when it comes to trade. We all rely on each other for various parts, components, the supply chain. Thinking about how it might go on as we go forward, senior economic advisor to Donald Trump, to the administration, has said that the US has suffered years, decades of abuse when it comes to trade. Is that correct by any stretch of the imagination?
Well, this is what's so fascinating about these messages we hear from the United States, is that what the administration says is often quite different from what the establishment says. And what I mean by that is what the State Department says is different from what the current political leader of that institution says. The economics, etc. What we have is a conflict within the United States between those who are before a particular president and who will be there afterwards, our career diplomats, our career civil servants, and a political establishment that believes that they are in place to stop the change that they're implementing. So part of this discourse is not just to put Donald Trump's agenda out to not just the Chinese and the Russians, but of course, as you say, even the European Union, the Mexicans, the Canadians. But it's also part of an internal discourse and a real internal battle. Now, this is played out within the State Department and with diplomats and senior figures going, but this is also playing out within the economics. We, of course, have previous US governments who have themselves created the very economic realities that Donald Trump is saying is so unfair. So in part, this is a narrative about what America had allowed itself to become. Now, if you ask former presidents and former economic advisors, there is a celebration of the fact that the United States created a global economic architecture aligned with a political architecture, with values, with democracy, with the liberal economic model at the heart of it. And that these things that Donald Trump is attacking were the concessions that allowed for the world to adopt the American economic model, which provided America with strength. Donald Trump lives in a much more black and white world, I would suggest. He perceives things in much more simple ways. He doesn't want us to know and study the most complex economic models to understand how economics works. He believes it is broken down into much more simple ways. And quite simply, if people are losing their jobs, it doesn't matter about the broader macroeconomics, he's going to get them back.
Sounds like it's more of a snub on his predecessors than the world at large.
Well, I think it's both, but I think part of it really is a statement about his belief that America had put itself in this position. And a huge amount of what this discourse is about is trying to create a changed narrative in the United States of America, that the prosperity of the world wasn't achieved because of America's success, but rather has been achieved at America's cost. And what's very clever about this is that you can avoid having the real debates about why there isn't a coal or a steel industry, about why jobs have actually gone to automation and to robots, not necessarily to other workers in other economies. You don't have to have those complex debates about the true realities of the economic and political realities of the 21st century. You can go back to the simple, give it to me and I'll make things better. And that will be the great test of Donald Trump, is when we will see whether we do indeed have the places in the United States where people believe that central government hasn't cared about them, where, and whether he's going to get them their jobs back.
US President Donald Trump is set to meet North Korea's supreme leader next week, Kim Jong-un. Can he do it? Can he successfully navigate, negotiate to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons?
One of the fascinating dichotomies of the Middle Eastern peace process was that it was the Israeli right, who normally you would say would be the least in favour of peace, who actually have ended up doing most of the deals when Israel's given up land. And what's interesting about that is sometimes the least likely guy becomes the person who does it, because when they do it, people say, wow, if he's going to do it, it might be okay. I think Trump, more by accident and design, has found himself in this particular situation where meeting with North Korea is not something which is going to be perceived domestically or internationally as being a sign of weakness, but rather allows Donald Trump to say, well, look, I was tough, I was uncompromising, I said to him, don't do this or there'll be consequences, and look, he's given in, he's caved. The North Koreans, though, of course, are not going to say that. They're not going to say they've given up. They're not going to say that they're giving anything. And so what will be fascinating is whether with Donald Trump we will see someone who on the one hand is flexing his muscles, but the other hand is demonstrating some sense of political subtlety. And we've already seen that just the North Koreans making the odd complaint publicly about the talks resulted initially in Trump pulling out of it.
So will the 12th of June go down in history as the end of the Korean War? Donald Trump in that history book?
Well, as funny as that may sound to people, how unlikely was it that this meeting would have taken place not so long ago? We, of course, have had this historic meeting between the South and the North that took place, and the symbolism of it, the way it was conducted, the you step into my country, I step into yours, the planting of the tree, this really was something that was profound. Now, the interesting question is, can North Korea, its reasoning behind this meeting, be trusted? Is this being done through a genuine change in their strategic view? Are they generally feeling they have to move forward, or is it something else? And that, I think, is going to be the huge test, certainly for Donald Trump's administration, as to whether North Korea is doing this in order to be let off the hook for a short while, to get certain concessions, particularly in regards to aid for its people, and the fact that while the state has been kind of economically clinging on by its fingernails, the humanitarian consequences have been extreme within North Korea. Is it designed for those short-term aims, or is there a genuine sense of them moving in from the cold? And I give you the example of Colonel Gaddafi. When Gaddafi decided a few years after 9/11, in around 2004, that he was going to, he no longer was going to be the guy of Lockerbie and all these attacks, he was going to declare responsibility, put money forward, realign himself with the United States and with Europe. And remember, it was Tony Blair who flew in, and the EU signed all these deals with him. This was seen by the Bush administration at the time as proof that its strength policy had worked. Gaddafi before had celebrated being anti-American, but after the United States had gone into Iraq, the theory was, well, Gaddafi says, I don't want this to happen to me. I better come in from the cold before I get regime change next. That, I think, is such an important parallel with North Korea.
Because Iran is also a very topical theme at the moment. Again, people in Iran are the ones that suffer. Also, out of Iran, people wanting to do business with Iran. What is going on there? What is the strategic game that Donald Trump is playing?
Well, I think with Iran, Trump's policy is very, very clear. He believes, as do most of the Republican Party, who vociferously opposed the deal done under the Obama administration by John Kerry and by Obama, together, of course, with the European Union and with China and Russia and others. They profoundly disagreed with the deal. And there were two reasons why, which dominate what Donald Trump is doing now. The first is whether it really dealt with a nuke at all. But actually, while that's what we hear most about, the second issue is actually far more prime and far more central. And that was that what bothers the United States, and most particularly its allies, and here we're talking about countries who don't talk to each other historically but now find themselves in common interest, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia leading the Gulf states very much in this regard, is a sense that what they fear and what their real problem is that they believe Iran is seeking regional hegemony. Not just that, they're seeking to create other Irans.
But yet Europe is very much pro keeping the nuclear accord.
Yes. Now, Trump, but So the logic of Europe and Obama at the time was very simple. We can deal with Iran's hegemonic issues. Let's take the apocalyptic issue off the table. The thing that we cannot deal with in normative politics is a nuke. So let's address the nuclear issue. They're never going to agree to hegemonic preconditions, so why introduce them into the deal? And once that occurs, we can then deal with Iran attempting to have influence in the region. We're strong enough to deal with that. We've got strong enough allies. What Trump would say, and he will get some agreement, by the way, from parts of the US strategic establishment that would disagree with him quite profoundly on other issues, is that what's happened over the last couple of years is that that dynamic has become more and more stark, because Iran is not just potentially, but is now deeply involved and against Saudi Arabia in the civil war in Yemen, on the ground in Iraq, and more in Lebanon. We've, of course, got this issue now of Israel and Iran directly militarily engaging each other around Syria. So we now have a situation where Iran is potentially militarily entrenching itself within the region. And that is in no way dealt with by the nuclear deal. Now, Trump, as I said before, likes to do things in black and white, and that's his appeal. So he's not going to communicate that nuance to the American public. He's simply going to say, the deal doesn't get rid of the nuke. That's why we're getting rid of it. And by the way, Iran, of course, must it do to respond? Well, you start enriching uranium again, because if the whole point of the deal is that you stop doing that, start it up again. But of course, all that does is play into Donald Trump, because he says, well, look, didn't I tell you, look, they've restarted their nuclear program with a click of a finger overnight. It
does very much feel that sometimes we're taking many steps backwards instead of forwards. Generally speaking, as a general comment, the world over.
Yeah, I think we are in relatively dangerous times. But going back to one of the points I was making before about the European Union, I think we do forget how much some of the institutions that were placed after World War II are creating a certain amount of insulation from this. You know, the King of Jordan a couple of years ago said World War III has started, the West just hasn't realised it yet. And if you're sitting where he is, that's what the world looks like. But it actually doesn't look like that for other world leaders. Of course, there is the potential for that to happen. But if you compare where we are in terms of these military crises, these political problems going on in the world, we have not default domino affected into global conflict in the way that we did before World War I and World War II.
Hagai, it's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you for your analysis.
You too. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.